Hi there. Tonight we journey back in time, not to a battlefield or a royal court, but into the surprisingly intricate, often bewildering, and sometimes even heartwarming world of medieval marriage. Imagine yourself trudging along a muddy track, perhaps on your way to witness a betrothal, or maybe even your own, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You might be a peasant, your hands calloused from the fields, or a noble, your silken sleeves rustling in the breeze. Either way, your future, and indeed your very survival, is likely tied to a spouse, chosen not always by you, but by forces far beyond your control. You probably won't survive this, or at least, your modern sensibilities won't so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy historical tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, fading shadows across the medieval landscape, you might find yourself contemplating something that, to us, seems utterly foreign: the concept of love, or rather, its frequent absence in the early stages of medieval marriage. While popular romance novels and Hollywood blockbusters often paint a picture of knights sweeping maidens off their feet, the reality was, shall we say, a touch more pragmatic. For centuries, marriage was primarily an economic and social contract, a way to secure alliances, consolidate land, or simply ensure the continuation of a family line. It wasn't about butterflies in your stomach or declarations under a moonlit sky. Those grand gestures were largely reserved for the fantastical world of courtly love, a concept we'll explore later, which existed in parallel, often completely separate from actual marital bonds. Now, this isn't to say that love was entirely absent. Humans are, after all, rather emotional creatures, even back then. There are scattered records, letters, and even some rather dry legal documents that hint at affection developing after the knot was tied. Imagine a young couple, perhaps barely out of childhood, brought together for strategic reasons. They might initially feel awkward, perhaps even resentful of their circumstances. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, sharing a hearth, raising children, and facing life's myriad challenges together, a quiet companionship could blossom into genuine fondness, respect, and yes, even love. It wasn't the fiery, passionate love we often idealize today, but a steady, enduring affection forged in the crucible of shared existence. One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is that, especially in the early medieval period, mutual consent of the bride and groom was not always a legal requirement for a valid marriage. Parental consent, or the consent of a guardian, often held far more weight. You might be led to the altar, perhaps a bit bewildered by your father's decree rather than your own heartfelt desire. This wasn't necessarily seen as cruel, but simply the way things were done, a necessary mechanism for societal stability. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite this, some scholars argue that elopement, while socially scandalous, was surprisingly common among certain segments of the population, a quiet rebellion against the strictures of arranged unions. Imagine the whispered plans, the hurried packing of a few meager belongings under the cloak of night, all for the slim hope of choosing your own destiny. Historians still argue whether the concept of romantic love, as we understand it, truly existed in the early medieval mind, or if it was a later societal construct. Did they simply not feel it in the same way? Or did they simply not articulate it in the same way? It's a fascinating question, isn't it? As you drift deeper into this historical reverie, consider how your own understanding of love might have been shaped by the expectations of your time. In medieval Europe, the grand love story was often a family's legacy, not an individual's journey. So, with love often taking a back seat, you might wonder what did drive the medieval marriage machine. The answer, my friend, is quite simple, yet endlessly complex. Arranged marriages. Now, when you hear arranged marriage, your mind might conjure images of stern, unsmiling elders forcing two reluctant souls together. And while there was certainly an element of that, it wasn't always the harsh, unfeeling transaction we sometimes imagine. Think of it less as a romantic pairing and more as a strategic alliance, a vital piece in the elaborate chess game of medieval society. For noble families, a marriage was a potent tool for power consolidation. Imagine two powerful lords, perhaps eyeing each other's lands with a mix of suspicion and envy. A marriage between their children could transform potential rivals into allies, securing borders, expanding influence, and ensuring mutual defense. You weren't just marrying a person, you were marrying their family, their lands, their resources, and their network of connections. It was like a medieval merger and acquisition, but with more feast days and less paperwork. Although, come to think of it, there was probably quite a bit of parchment involved. It definitely beat trying to conquer their lands, which tended to be rather messy and expensive. For the peasantry, the motivations were equally practical, though on a much smaller scale. If you were a farmer, marrying the daughter of a neighboring farmer could mean access to more labor, a better harvest, or a small plot of land that perfectly complemented your own. It was about economic viability and survival. Two families joining forces could better withstand the harsh realities of medieval life: bad harvests, disease, or the occasional raiding party. It was a partnership, a practical agreement to pool resources and face the world together. Your parents weren't just thinking about your happiness. They were thinking about keeping the family fed and warm through the winter. And, let's be honest, in the medieval period, that was often the truest form of love. A mainstream historical fact is that parents often began considering marriage prospects for their children when they were still quite young, sometimes even in infancy for royal families. It was all about long-term planning, securing the future of the lineage. This wasn't because they were particularly eager to get rid of you, but because the stakes were incredibly high. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite the prevalence of arranged marriages, there are fascinating accounts of medieval matchmaking fairs in some regions, where young people, under the watchful eyes of their families, could actually meet potential spouses. It wasn't quite speed dating, but it offered a tiny glimmer of agency in a system designed for control. Imagine the nervous glances across a bustling market square, trying to subtly size up your potential future. Historians still argue whether the choice involved in arranged marriages, even for the most powerful, truly felt like a choice at all, or if it was simply an acceptance of an inevitable fate. Was there genuine negotiation, or merely polite acquiescence to parental decree? The answer likely varies widely from individual to individual, but it's safe to say that the concept of free choice, as we understand it, simply wasn't on the menu. You were a pawn, perhaps a valuable one, in a much larger game, and understanding that fundamental truth is key to grasping the core of medieval marriage. Once the decision to marry had been made, whether by your own unlikely choice or by your family's strategic machinations, you entered the world of the betrothal process. This wasn't just a casual promise. It was a legally binding agreement, often as serious as the wedding itself, if not more so in terms of its practical implications. Imagine standing before witnesses, perhaps in a dusty hall or a quiet church, as hands were clasped and vows exchanged, long before any rings were slipped onto fingers. This was the moment your future was officially charted, and backing out could have severe repercussions, not just for you, but for your entire family's reputation and financial standing. It wasn't exactly a fun little engagement party. It was more like signing a very serious contract with a lot of awkward staring. The betrothal, or sponsalia, as it was known in some legal traditions, often involved a series of rituals designed to solidify the agreement. You might find yourself exchanging tokens, perhaps a ring, though not necessarily the one you'd wear on your wedding day, or a coin broken in half, each party keeping a piece. These were not mere symbols. They were tangible proof of the commitment. You might also participate in a formal feast, a public declaration of the impending union, where the two families, perhaps previously wary of each other, would share bread and ale, attempting to project an image of newfound camaraderie. You'd be sitting there, trying to make polite conversation with your future in-laws, wondering if they snore as loudly as your own dad. A mainstream historical fact is that the betrothal often occurred years before the actual marriage, particularly if the parties involved were very young or if there were complex political or financial arrangements to be ironed out. This extended period allowed for the careful negotiation of dowries, the solidification of alliances, and sometimes the opportunity for the betrothed couple to, perhaps, get to know each other a little, or at least get used to the idea of each other. A quirky tidbit, though, is that in some regions, a formal kiss, known as the kiss of peace, was part of the betrothal ceremony, signifying the binding nature of the agreement. Imagine that first official kiss, perhaps feeling less like a romantic moment and more like a handshake, but with lips. A very formal, public handshake. Historians still argue whether the betrothal itself was considered a sacrament, as binding as marriage, or merely a preparatory step. Did breaking a betrothal carry the same spiritual weight as breaking a marriage vow? The Church's stance on this evolved over time, reflecting the ongoing struggle between spiritual ideals and worldly practicalities. For you, the medieval person, it likely felt utterly irreversible. Once those promises were made, you were effectively off the market, your path set. Your future spouse's face perhaps still a vague outline in your mind, but their destiny firmly intertwined with yours. You were well and truly hooked, line and sinker, long before the wedding bells even considered chiming. With the betrothal firmly established, you now entered the often lengthy and sometimes contentious phase of negotiating the dowry and bride price. Forget modern prenuptial agreements. These were the medieval equivalent, but with far greater stakes, and often much more dramatic flair. Imagine the tension in the room as to families, represented by their patriarchs, perhaps aided by shrewd legal minds, or trusted intermediaries, haggled over livestock, parcels of land, chests of linens, and even household servants. This wasn't about who got the bigger slice of wedding cake. It was about securing your future, your family's status, and the very foundation of the new union. The dowry, typically provided by the bride's family to the groom or his family, was essentially a transfer of wealth. It served multiple purposes. For the groom, it could be a significant boost to his resources, perhaps enabling him to expand his lands, build a new mill, or simply provide for his new wife. For the bride, it was, in theory, her share of her family's inheritance, a form of financial security. If you were a medieval woman, your dowry was often the only substantial property you might ever control, even if only indirectly. It was your leverage, your worth, and sometimes your only ticket to a respectable marriage. No dowry, no marriage, often meant a life of dependency or the convent. It certainly wasn't about choosing a color scheme for your big day. Conversely, in some regions and cultures, especially in the early medieval period and among certain Germanic traditions, a bride price, also known as a morgengeb or morning gift, after the wedding night was given by the groom to the bride or her family. This was less about supporting the new couple and more about compensating her family for the loss of their daughter's labor and lineage. It also acted as a form of marital insurance for the wife, providing her with personal property independent of her husband's control, offering a degree of security should he die or the marriage dissolve. Imagine a nervous groom counting out a few prized sheep or a handful of silver coins, hoping it's enough to impress his future father-in-law. A mainstream historical fact is that the size and nature of the dowry or bride price directly reflected the social standing and wealth of the families involved. For nobles, this could involve entire estates, castles, or even strategic castles. For peasants, it might be a few cows, a pig, or a generous supply of grain and fabric. A quirky tidbit, however, is that some dowries included incredibly specific and unusual items, like a particular beehive, a rare falcon, or even the right to collect tolls from a certain bridge. Imagine the legal wrangling over a particularly productive beehive. It probably caused more arguments than the actual land itself. Historians still argue whether the dowry system empowered women by giving them a form of wealth, or if it simply commodified them, making them objects of financial transaction. Did it offer genuine security, or merely reinforce their status as transferable property? You, as the medieval individual, might have felt both the burden of expectation and the security of knowing your dowry secured your place. A complex mix of feelings far removed from any modern dating app. Now, let's talk about something that often raises a collective eyebrow in our modern world: the age of consent in medieval marriages. You might imagine starry-eyed teenagers, but often the reality was far younger. Imagine a child, perhaps barely out of their toddler years, being formally betrothed, their future sealed before they even knew what marriage truly meant. While the actual wedding might be delayed until a more suitable age, the commitment was nonetheless binding from a surprisingly early point. It was a world where childhood, as we understand it, was a much briefer and more precarious affair. The Church, in its efforts to regulate marriage, set the canonical age for boys at 14 and for girls at 12. This meant that legally, you could be married at an age where, today, you'd be more concerned with homework and video games than with managing a household or producing heirs. Imagine yourself, at 12 years old, being told that your life's partner had been chosen, and that soon you'd be leaving your childhood home to join a new family. It wasn't about readiness or emotional maturity. It was about physical capacity for procreation and the strategic needs of the family. A girl of 12 was considered capable of bearing children, and that, fundamentally, was her primary marital purpose. It definitely puts those awkward middle school dances into perspective, doesn't it? A mainstream historical fact is that while these canonical ages were set, marriages often involved children even younger, particularly in noble families. where alliances were crucial and securing them early was paramount. These were typically betrothals, with the actual consummation of the marriage delayed until puberty. A quirky tidbit, however, is that there are fascinating legal cases from the medieval period where child brides or grooms, upon reaching the age of consent, formally repudiated their marriages, stating they had been too young to understand or agree. Imagine the courage it would take for a young person to stand up against the might of their family and the church, declaring, "No, I actually don't want to marry that person I was betrothed to when I was 5. It certainly wasn't a common occurrence, but it shows glimmers of individual will even in such a restrictive system. Historians still argue whether the delay between betrothal and actual marriage in cases of child brides and grooms was primarily for practical reasons like waiting for physical maturity, or if it subtly acknowledged a need for a degree of personal development before the full responsibilities of marriage were undertaken. Was there a hidden understanding that even a child needed some time to grow into such a momentous role? Regardless, for you, the medieval youth, reaching the age of 12 or 14 would have marked a profound shift, signaling the imminent end of your childhood and the beginning of your adult responsibilities. No gap years, no backpacking through Europe, just straight into adulting, medieval style, with the betrothal sealed and the dowry or bride price negotiated. The day finally arrived for the medieval wedding day rituals. Forget the elaborate, Pinterest-perfect ceremonies of today. A medieval wedding could be surprisingly understated, yet steeped in symbolism and local tradition. Imagine a quiet procession, perhaps from your family home to the local church, or even just to the church porch, where much of the essential ceremony often took place. The air might be cool, perhaps, damp, and the scent of damp earth and unwashed bodies would mingle with the faint aroma of incense. You'd be nervous, of course, your heart thumping, knowing that this day irrevocably changed your status and your life. The mainstream historical fact is that for much of the medieval period, the church's involvement in marriage ceremonies was less formal than it became later. You wouldn't necessarily have a grand mass with choirs and stained glass lights streaming down. Often, the most crucial part of the ceremony, the exchange of vows and consent, happened at the church door. The priest would officiate, but it was the public declaration, the witnessed "I do," that truly sealed the deal. Imagine standing there, on the threshold between the sacred and the secular, your voice perhaps a little shaky as you spoke the words that bound you forever. After the vows, a blessing would typically be given, sometimes inside the church, sometimes still at the door. Then came the rings, simple bands of metal, exchanged as symbols of eternal commitment. There wasn't a particular emphasis on expensive diamonds. It was the symbol that mattered. A quirky tidbit, however, is that in some regions, a peculiar ritual involved literally tying the knot, not just metaphorically, but with ribbons or cords around the couple's hands, a physical representation of their binding union. Imagine your hands, perhaps a little sweaty with nerves, being physically bound together, a tangible promise that you're now quite literally in this together. No backing out now. Following the formal ceremony, the celebrations would begin. For the wealthy, this meant a lavish feast, with roasted meats, fine wines, and entertainment from minstrels and jesters. You might find yourself enduring endless toasts, probably feeling quite overwhelmed by all the attention. For peasants, the celebration would be simpler, perhaps a shared meal with neighbors and family, accompanied by singing, dancing, and plenty of ale. Regardless of your social standing, the community would gather, bearing witness to the new union and offering their good wishes, or perhaps their gossip. Historians still argue whether the public nature of these rituals was more about legal proof and societal acceptance, or if it also served as a subtle form of community policing, ensuring that proper customs were followed and no one was trying to pull a fast one. Was it a celebration or a surveillance operation? Probably a bit of both, knowing the medieval mind. As the day drew to a close, you'd feel the weight of your new status settle upon you, ready or not, for the journey ahead. As the wedding festivities began to wind down, a crucial, often whispered about, and deeply significant part of the medieval marriage ritual approached: consummation and legitimacy. This wasn't just about intimacy. It was a legal and theological linchpin that cemented the entire union. Imagine the awkward anticipation, perhaps a mix of trepidation and curiosity, as you, the newlywed, were escorted to your bedchamber. For nobles, this might have been a public procession, a rather undignified bedding ceremony where guests would actually accompany you, sometimes even stripping you of your outer garments before leaving you to your ahem duties. For peasants, it was likely more private, but the underlying expectation remained the same. It certainly wasn't a candlelit dinner for two. It was a very public expectation with very private consequences. The mainstream historical fact here is that, according to canon law, a marriage was not fully valid and indissoluble until it was consummated. Consent and vows were important, but the physical act itself was what truly sealed the bond in the eyes of the church. This meant that if a marriage was not consummated, it could, in theory, be annulled. This legal loophole, while rarely used, was a critical point of contention and sometimes a pathway out of an unwanted union for those with enough influence. Imagine the pressure on you, the groom, to perform, or on you, the bride, to accept, knowing the entire validity of your marriage hinged on this one act. A quirky tidbit, however, is that while consummation was crucial, there were often very specific, sometimes bizarre, rituals to prove it had occurred. In some aristocratic circles, sheets might be inspected the next morning for evidence of blood, presented to witnesses as proof of virginity lost and marriage sealed. Imagine the utter mortification of having your bedsheets paraded before your family and friends. It makes post-wedding brunch seem positively charming. In other cases, simply the husband's testimony, or even the wife's confirming the act, was deemed sufficient, though perhaps with less fanfare and fewer white linens on display. Historians still argue whether the church's emphasis on consummation was primarily about ensuring the potential for procreation and the continuation of lineages, or if it was a means of control, asserting spiritual authority over private lives. Did they genuinely believe the act itself conferred a divine blessing, or was it simply a convenient legal mechanism? Regardless, for you, the medieval newlywed, the wedding night was less about romance and more about duty, about fulfilling a contract, and about establishing the legitimacy of your union in a world where lineage and inheritance were paramount. It was the final, and perhaps most intimate, step in transforming two individuals into a single, legally recognized entity. Once the wedding was a distant memory, and the crucial act of consummation, for better or worse, complete, you, as a newly married peasant, would quickly settle into the rhythms of peasant marriages and daily life. This wasn't a life of grand balls and courtly intrigue. It was a life dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the constant demands of the land. Imagine waking before dawn, the air chilly and damp, as you heard the rustle of straw in your modest hovel, knowing another day of back-breaking labor awaited you both. Your marriage wasn't just a union of hearts, it was a union of hands, a partnership in sheer survival. For the vast majority of medieval people, marriage was fundamentally a working partnership. If you were a peasant man, your primary duty was to work the fields, ensuring enough food was produced to feed your family and meet your obligations to the Lord. You'd be plowing, sowing, harvesting, your muscles aching at the end of each day. If you were a peasant woman, your tasks were equally demanding, managing the household, preparing meals over an open fire, spinning wool, weaving cloth, tending a small garden, and, of course, raising children. There was no clear division of labor in the modern sense. Everyone contributed, often overlapping in tasks, driven by the sheer necessity of keeping the family alive and functional. It was a very hands-on approach to relationship building, mostly involving actual hands in actual dirt. A mainstream historical fact is that the average life expectancy for medieval peasants was relatively low, meaning marriages, while enduring, were often shorter than today. Death, particularly from childbirth or illness, was a constant shadow, and remarriage was common and often necessary for economic stability. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite the harshness of their lives, archaeological finds and some surviving legal documents suggest that peasant communities often had surprisingly strong social bonds and mutual aid networks. Imagine your neighbors pitching in to help with a harvest if one of you fell ill, or sharing a communal bread oven. Marriage was a core unit of these networks, extending beyond just the immediate couple. Historians still argue whether the absence of romantic love as a primary marital driver among peasants led to more stable unions, free from the turbulent expectations of emotional fulfillment, or if it simply meant a stoic acceptance of one's lot. Did the sheer necessity of partnership foster a deeper, more resilient form of connection? For you, the medieval peasant, love might not have been the reason you married, but a quiet, enduring affection likely grew from the shared struggle. The comforting presence beside you during long winter nights, and the shared joy of a bountiful harvest. It was a practical love, a comforting weight, and the bedrock of your arduous but persistent existence. Shifting gears from the muddy fields of the peasantry, let's ascend to the rarefied, often gilded and fiercely political world of noble marriages. Here, your marriage wasn't just about personal survival, it was about the survival and expansion of an entire lineage, a kingdom, or even an empire. Imagine yourself as a young noble, perhaps a princess or a duke's son, attending a grand feast. Every conversation, every interaction could be a subtle dance of negotiation, a probing of alliances, all leading to the ultimate goal, a strategically advantageous marriage. Your life, from an early age, was not your own. It was a pawn in a much larger, high-stakes Game of Thrones. For nobles, marriage was the ultimate political tool. A well-placed marriage could solidify peace after a long war, preventing future bloodshed. It could unite two powerful families, merging their lands, armies, and wealth to create an even more formidable entity. You might find yourself betrothed to a complete stranger from a distant land, someone you'd never met, whose language you barely spoke. Your personal feelings were utterly irrelevant compared to the vast geopolitical implications of your union. It was less about choosing a life partner and more about signing a treaty, often written in blood and sealed with a royal seal. It certainly made awkward family dinners seem like a walk in the park. A mainstream historical fact is that noble marriages often involved incredibly detailed contracts, outlining not just dowries, but also successional rights, military obligations, and even the number of personal attendants the bride could bring with her. These documents were meticulously crafted, sometimes spanning dozens of pages, leaving little to chance. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite all this careful planning, historical records are rife with stories of noble brides or grooms who, upon meeting, found each other so utterly repulsive that the marriage, if it even proceeded, became a miserable affair, sometimes even leading to outright rebellion or clandestine affairs. Imagine being locked into a lifelong political alliance with someone who chewed with their mouth open. But on a much grander, kingdom-shaking scale, historians still argue whether these purely political unions, devoid of personal affection, were more stable in the long run because they weren't swayed by fleeting emotions, or if they ultimately sowed the seeds of discontent and instability. Did the pragmatism lead to stronger states, or did the personal misery eventually undermine the very foundations they sought to secure? For you, the medieval noble, your marriage was your duty, your sacrifice, and your contribution to the enduring legacy of your family name. It was a heavy crown to wear, far heavier than any jeweled circlet. Now, let's turn our attention to the growing influence of an institution that steadily wove itself into the fabric of medieval marriage: the role of the Church. In the early Middle Ages, marriage was largely a secular affair, a matter of family, custom, and local law. But over centuries, the Church gradually asserted its authority, transforming marriage from a mere contract into a sacred sacrament, a divine institution ordained by God. Imagine the shift from a simple handfasting before witnesses to a solemn ceremony beneath the vaulted arches of a cathedral, infused with religious significance. This was the Church gently, but persistently, inserting itself into the most intimate aspects of your life. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 12th century, largely due to the reforms of Pope Innocent III and the Fourth Lateran Council, marriage officially became one of the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. This had profound implications. It meant that marriage was no longer just a legal agreement that could be easily broken. It was an indissoluble bond, a spiritual union blessed by God. You couldn't just decide you didn't like your spouse anymore and pack your bags. Divorce, as we understand it, became virtually impossible. The Church's doctrine emphasized permanence, fidelity, and the procreation of children within the holy confines of matrimony. It was a divine binding, not just a human one, which certainly complicated things if your spouse snored. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite the Church's increasing control, local customs and folk beliefs surrounding marriage persisted, sometimes blending uneasily with official doctrine. You might still find people performing ancient rituals for fertility or warding off evil spirits from the newlyweds, alongside their attendance at Mass. Imagine a peasant couple devoutly receiving a blessing from the priest, but then secretly burying a charm under their doorstep for good luck. The Church preached doctrine, but old habits, especially those rooted in the land and tradition, died hard. Historians still argue whether the Church's elevation of marriage to a sacrament ultimately strengthened family units and social cohesion, or if its rigid doctrines, particularly on indissolubility, created more hardship and misery for individuals trapped in unhappy or abusive unions. Did it bring spiritual sanctity or practical inflexibility? For you, the medieval person, the Church's increasing presence meant that your marriage was under constant divine scrutiny. It wasn't just your parents watching, God was watching too, making sure you stuck to those vows. This spiritual weight added another layer of solemnity and perhaps a touch of existential dread to the already complex institution of medieval marriage. Given the Church's firm stance on marriage as an indissoluble sacrament, you might wonder how, then, a medieval marriage could possibly end if it went awry. The answer lies in a crucial distinction that often confuses modern minds: the difference between annulment and divorce. Forget the clean break of a modern divorce. That simply wasn't an option. Instead, you navigated a labyrinthine legal and ecclesiastical system that offered a very specific and often very difficult path out. Annulment. Imagine, for a moment, that your marriage has become unbearable, perhaps due to a secret impediment you've discovered, or perhaps merely because you and your spouse genuinely despise each other. You couldn't just say, "I want a divorce." What you could do was seek an annulment, which was fundamentally different. A mainstream historical fact is that an annulment declared that a valid marriage never existed in the first place. It wasn't ending a marriage, it was declaring it null and void from its inception, as if it had never happened. The Church maintained that what God had joined, no man could separate. Therefore, if a marriage was separated, it must mean God had never truly joined them due to some impediment that existed at the time of the vows. The grounds for annulment were incredibly specific and often quite arcane. You might claim consanguinity to close a blood relationship, even if distant. Affinity relationship by marriage, for example, your spouse's cousin. Pre-existing vows to God, one of you had secretly sworn to become a monk or nun. Impotence, inability to consummate the marriage, or even coercion, you were forced into the marriage against your will. Imagine trying to prove one of these in a medieval ecclesiastical court, with witnesses, legal arguments, and the very real possibility of public shame. It was a tedious, expensive, and often humiliating process, far from a quick trip to the divorce court. It was certainly not an easy out if your main complaint was just that your spouse left their chainmail lying around. A quirky tidbit, however, is that while annulments were difficult, noble and royal families sometimes found ways to exploit these rules for political gain. A powerful monarch might suddenly discover a distant familial tie to their spouse when a more advantageous alliance presented itself. This led to sometimes farcical legal battles, where genealogists were brought in to trace incredibly obscure family trees, all in the name of proving that, oops, you are actually distantly related to your spouse, and thus your marriage was never valid. Imagine having a family tree so convoluted it could win an award for most tangled roots. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict stance on annulment, rather than outright divorce, paradoxically benefited women by preventing men from easily discarding their wives, or if it simply trapped them in unbearable situations with no recourse. Did it provide stability for women who might otherwise be vulnerable, or did it inflict greater misery? For you, the medieval individual, the annulment process was a grim, often desperate, last resort, a testament to the iron grip the Church held over the sanctity, or rather, the non-existence of your marital bond. When the sacred bond of medieval marriage was breached, especially through infidelity, the consequences were often severe and deeply gendered. Let's delve into the murky waters of adultery and its consequences in the medieval world. Imagine the whispers, the rumors, the sudden chill in the air when suspicion fell upon a husband or, far more commonly, a wife. The sin of adultery wasn't just a personal failing, it was a societal transgression, a threat to lineage, property, and the very fabric of social order. It definitely wasn't something you could just brush off with a quick apology and a bunch of flowers. For a mainstream historical fact, the legal and social repercussions for adultery were vastly different depending on whether you were a man or a woman. For a woman, adultery was considered a grave sin and a serious crime, a threat to the legitimacy of heirs and the husband's property rights. Her punishment could range from public humiliation. Imagine being paraded through the streets, perhaps with your hair shorn or a scarlet letter equivalent stitched to your clothing, to severe physical penalties, imprisonment, or even death. In some early medieval legal codes, her reputation would be utterly ruined, and she might be cast out from her home, losing all status and support. It was a brutal reminder of the patriarchal nature of medieval society, where a woman's honor was inextricably tied to her sexual fidelity. It was less about betrayal and more about property damage. Unfortunately, for a man, while adultery was still considered a sin by the church, the legal and social consequences were typically far less severe. His dalliances might be seen as regrettable, perhaps even a bit scandalous, but they rarely carried the same catastrophic penalties. His legitimacy of heirs was not generally called into question, as he was the one introducing the potentially illegitimate child. He might face penance from the church, or perhaps a fine, but rarely the public shaming or physical punishment meted out to women. A quirky tidbit here is that sometimes, particularly among the nobility, a husband's adultery might be tacitly ignored, especially if it involved a lower status woman and posed no threat to the primary lineage. It was often viewed as a boys will be boys scenario, which, looking back, is rather infuriating, isn't it? Historians still argue whether the extreme disparity in punishment for male versus female adultery was purely a reflection of patriarchal power structures, or if it also stemmed from a genuine societal fear of illegitimate heirs inheriting property and titles. Was it about controlling women's bodies, or about protecting male lines of descent? For you, the medieval individual, the spectre of adultery, particularly if you were a woman, hung heavy, a stark reminder of the fragile boundaries of acceptable behavior and the harsh consequences of stepping beyond them. It was a very good reason to keep your romantic imagination firmly within the confines of courtly love poems and safely away from actual dalliances. Having explored the often harsh realities of fidelity and its breaches, let's now consider another fundamental aspect of medieval marriage: women's rights in marriage. To put it mildly, your legal standing as a medieval wife was, by modern standards, incredibly limited. Imagine stepping into a legal chamber, perhaps dimly lit and smelling of parchment and dust, only to realize that in the eyes of the law, you largely ceased to exist as an independent entity once you uttered those vows. It was a world where men held almost all the cards, and women navigated a system largely designed to control their bodies, their property, and their futures. A mainstream historical fact is that under common law traditions prevalent in much of medieval Europe, particularly England, a legal concept known as coverture effectively meant that a married woman's legal identity was subsumed by that of her husband. You were, in essence, legally one with your husband, but he was the one who truly mattered. You couldn't own property independently, sue or be sued, or enter into contracts without your husband's consent. Your earnings, your inheritance, unless specifically protected by a prenuptial agreement, which was rare and mostly for the very wealthy, and even your body were largely considered his property. It was like being part of a two-person team where only one person had a voice, and it wasn't yours. It certainly made opening a medieval bank account a bit tricky. However, a quirky tidbit is that while coverture was the dominant legal framework, there were regional variations and exceptions. In some towns and cities, particularly those with strong merchant guilds, married women, especially widows, could sometimes retain more control over property and even run businesses independently. Imagine a resilient medieval businesswoman haggling over prices in the market, a testament to female agency pushing against the restrictive legal norms. Also, dower rights, which granted a widow a portion of her deceased husband's property for her lifetime, provided a crucial, albeit post-mortem, form of security for women. Historians still argue whether the protection offered by coverture, the husband was legally responsible for his wife's debts and actions, outweighed the severe limitations it placed on women's autonomy. Did it provide a fragile security in a brutal world, or did it merely reinforce subjugation? For you, the medieval wife, navigating daily life meant constantly operating within these legal constraints, perhaps subtly influencing your husband's decisions or finding quiet ways to exert control within the domestic sphere. Your power was not overt. It was often indirect, a gentle nudge rather than a firm hand, a testament to ingenuity in a system built against you. Within the confines of medieval marriage, often the most paramount goal, particularly for noble families, was the production of children and inheritance. Your primary duty as a married woman, beyond managing the household, was to bear heirs, specifically male heirs, to continue the family line and ensure the transmission of property and power. Imagine the immense pressure, the constant anxiety that would weigh on you, especially if each passing year brought no swelling belly or worse, brought only daughters when sons were desperately needed. It was a relentless expectation, a biological imperative wrapped in layers of social and economic necessity. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the vast majority of the family's land and titles, became increasingly entrenched throughout the medieval period. This system aimed to prevent the fragmentation of estates and maintain the power and wealth of noble families. For you, as a medieval father, having a healthy son meant the continuity of your name, your legacy, and the stability of your lineage. For daughters, while cherished, their primary role in terms of inheritance was often to be married off, their dowries serving as their portion, transferring wealth and forging alliances rather than directly inheriting land. It sounds like a very high-stakes game of family monopoly, doesn't it? However, a quirky tidbit is that in cases where there were no male heirs, or only very young ones, some medieval legal systems allowed for coercer's daughters, who would divide the inheritance, sometimes leading to complex, fragmented estates, or forcing powerful marriages to consolidate them again. Imagine the strategic puzzles this presented for noble families trying to secure their future. And while sons were preferred, daughters could still be incredibly valuable as pawns in the intricate game of political marriage. As we've discussed, historians still argue whether the intense focus on male inheritance and primogeniture ultimately strengthened kingdoms by preventing the division of power, or if it led to resentment, infighting among siblings, and even outright civil wars for succession. Did it create stability, or did it merely bottle up explosive dynastic conflicts? For you, the medieval parent, the birth of a child, especially a son, was not just a joyous occasion, but a moment of profound relief and triumph, a testament to your fulfillment of a fundamental duty. It was the ultimate guarantee that your life, and the life of your family, would continue to ripple through the generations. Life in the medieval period was often tragically short, and death, unfortunately, was a constant companion. This harsh reality meant that many individuals found themselves facing the prospect of remarriage after death, navigating the complex social and economic landscape as a widow or widower. Imagine the somber period of mourning, perhaps draped in dark wool, as you contemplated a future without your spouse, knowing that practicality often dictated you wouldn't remain alone for long. Your personal grief was often tempered by the urgent need to secure your own position or that of your children. It certainly made modern dating apps seem like a breezy afternoon stroll. For a mainstream historical fact, remarriage was not only common but often encouraged, and sometimes even necessitated, for both widows and widowers. For a widower, particularly one with children, a new wife was essential to manage the household, care for the children, and potentially provide new heirs. His social and economic standing rarely diminished. In fact, a wealthy widower was often a highly desirable match. Imagine a lord, his first wife gone, quickly seeking a new lady to oversee his castle and perhaps bear him more sons. The continuity of his line paramount. For a widow, the situation was often more precarious and complex, while some widows, especially wealthy noblewomen, could enjoy a surprising degree of independence and control over their dowries and dower lands. Many others faced immense pressure to remarry for economic security and social protection. Without a husband, a woman was vulnerable. In a patriarchal society, she might lose control of her land, be subject to exploitation, or find it difficult to support her children. A second marriage could offer stability, but it also meant losing some of that newfound autonomy. It was a delicate balance between security and control, often dictated by circumstances far beyond your individual wishes. A quirky tidbit, however, is that there are fascinating historical accounts of defiant widows who staunchly refused to remarry, fiercely guarding their independence and their inherited wealth, much to the chagrin of their families, who wished to marry them off for strategic alliances. Imagine a determined medieval woman fending off suitors and familial pressure, declaring her intention to remain mistress of her own domain. These were exceptional cases, but they highlight the agency some women could achieve through widowhood. Historians still argue whether the Church's stance on remarriage, which eventually softened from initial disapproval, especially for widows, recognizing the practicalities of medieval life, genuinely offered support to those who had lost a spouse, or if it simply reinforced the societal expectation that everyone should be married and contributing to the social order. Did it provide comfort, or merely perpetuate a cycle of dependency? For you, the medieval widow or widower, the decision to remarry was a profound one, tinged with both grief and the pragmatic recognition that life, in all its relentless demands, had to continue. Life in the Middle Ages, as you've likely gathered, was anything but a gentle stroll through a rose garden. And when it came to marriage, the challenges were compounded by the ever-present spectre of illness and disability. Imagine the quiet despair of a medieval couple facing a chronic illness, or the profound shift in your daily life if a spouse became disabled. These were not just personal tragedies. They had immediate and often devastating impacts on a family's ability to survive and thrive. It wasn't just a matter of cancelling your weekend plans. It could mean losing your livelihood. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was, by modern standards, rudimentary at best. Illnesses that we easily treat today were often fatal or led to permanent disability. If you or your spouse fell ill with something like tuberculosis, leprosy, or even a severe fever, the outcome was uncertain, and recovery often left lasting impairments. Imagine the fear as a loved one succumbed to the sweating sickness, or the quiet strength required to care for a spouse who had lost the use of their limbs after a fall. This placed an immense burden on the surviving or healthy partner, who often had to take on additional labor to compensate for the lost productivity. It was a brutal test of vows, like in sickness and in health, often without the benefit of a modern hospital or even a coherent understanding of germ theory. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite the lack of advanced medical knowledge, medieval communities often developed elaborate systems of care and support for the ill and disabled, driven by Christian charity and communal necessity. Monasteries often had infirmaries, and many communities would pool resources to help a family struggling with a sick member. Imagine your neighbors bringing food, or perhaps a local herbalist offering remedies, a testament to resilience and compassion in the face of widespread suffering. While not formal healthcare, it was a vital network of mutual aid. Historians still argue whether the high prevalence of illness and disability in medieval society paradoxically strengthened marital bonds by forcing couples to rely more heavily on each other, or if it added unbearable strain, sometimes leading to abandonment or neglect. Did shared hardship forge deeper connections, or did it expose the fragility of unions based purely on practicality? For you, the medieval spouse, navigating illness meant a daily struggle, a constant recalculation of resources, and often a profound acceptance of fate. It was a stark reminder of your vulnerability and the quiet heroism often required to simply endure. In a world brimming with uncertainty and the constant threat of illness, it's perhaps not surprising that people sought every possible advantage, even when it came to matters of the heart. This brings us to the curious world of love potions and charms in medieval Europe. Imagine a desperate young person, perhaps smitten with someone far above their station, or perhaps just weary of their family's chosen match, seeking out a wise woman or a cunning man in the village. They wouldn't be asking for dating advice. They'd be looking for a magical concoction or a whispered incantation to bend fate to their will. It was the medieval equivalent of swiping right, but with a lot more herbs and questionable ingredients. A mainstream historical fact is that despite the Church's strong condemnation of magic and pagan practices, belief in charms, spells, and love potions remained remarkably persistent throughout the medieval period, particularly among the common folk. These weren't necessarily malicious. Often, they were seen as harmless ways to influence affection, ensure fertility, or even protect a marriage from infidelity. You might hear whispers of a potion brewed under a full moon, using bizarre ingredients, like pigeons' blood, bat wings, not really, but you get the idea, or specific herbs gathered at dawn. The goal was to inspire love, or at least a powerful infatuation, in the desired person. It definitely made the concept of a blind date take on a whole new, slightly unsettling meaning. A quirky tidbit, however, is that some of these love potions contained genuinely psychoactive or even toxic substances, inadvertently causing real physiological effects that might have been misinterpreted as romantic attraction. Imagine accidentally dosing your crush with a mild hallucinogen, leading to a rather unsettling courtship. Other charms might involve elaborate rituals, like placing a specific item under someone's pillow, or whispering their name into a flowing stream. It was less about chemical reactions and more about psychological suggestion and deeply ingrained superstitions. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in love potions and charms reflected a deep-seated lack of agency in personal relationships, driving people to supernatural means, or if it was simply a form of folk psychology, a way for individuals to feel some control in a largely uncontrollable world. Did it offer genuine hope, or merely prey on vulnerability? For you, the medieval individual, turning to a love potion might have been a desperate gamble, a secret act of defiance against a predetermined future, or simply a hopeful gesture in a world where love was rarely a choice. And magic, however dubious, offered a tempting alternative. Having explored the practical, legal, and even magical facets of medieval marriage, let's now turn to a concept that often provides a stark contrast: courtly love versus reality. Imagine a world of gallant knights, fair ladies, secret admirers, and passionate declarations under moonlit skies. This was the idealized, often unattainable, realm of courtly love, a literary construct that flourished in the high Middle Ages. It offered a tantalizing escape from the often mundane and pragmatic, the reality of actual marital bonds. You might read a romantic poem or listen to a minstrel's song, and for a fleeting moment, dream of a love that transcended societal constraints. Mainstream historical fact is that courtly love was primarily a literary and philosophical concept, not a widespread social practice that genuinely undermined the institution of marriage. It found expression in epic poems, chivalric romances, and troubadour songs, particularly in Occitania, southern France, and later throughout Europe. The core tenets of courtly love often involved a knight's devotion to a married lady of higher social standing, a love that was typically unconsummated, illicit, and deeply spiritual. It was about adoration, service, and the ennobling effect of unfulfilled desire, often elevating the lady to an almost divine status. It was basically the medieval equivalent of having an incredibly intense, but entirely platonic, celebrity crush. A quirky tidbit, however, is that while purely platonic, the highly stylized language and rituals of courtly love could sometimes blur the lines, leading to real-life scandals or, at the very least, raised eyebrows. Imagine a knight composing a passionate poem to his lord's wife, full of flowery metaphors about her beauty and his undying devotion. While theoretically harmless, such intense expressions of admiration could easily be misinterpreted, or, indeed, could lead to genuine emotional entanglement. It certainly made casual flirting a high-stakes game. Historians still argue whether courtly love served as a safety valve for emotional expression in a society where marriage was often loveless, or if it merely reinforced existing social hierarchies. By emphasizing the unattainability of noble ladies, did it provide an outlet for suppressed emotions, or did it just perpetuate a romantic fantasy that had little bearing on actual marital happiness? For you, the medieval individual, the tales of courtly love offered a tantalizing glimpse into a world of passion and romance that likely bore little resemblance to your own arranged marriage. It was a beautiful dream, perhaps a soothing distraction, but one that ultimately existed in the realm of fiction, far from the shared duties and practical realities of your hearth and home. Having explored the strictures of medieval marriage and the escapism of courtly love, it's worth pausing to consider a topic often overlooked or actively suppressed in historical accounts: same-sex relationships. While certainly not recognized as marriages in the formal, sacramental sense, and often condemned by the Church, historical evidence suggests that intimate partnerships between individuals of the same sex did exist in various forms throughout the medieval period. Imagine navigating a society where your deepest affections were deemed sinful, perhaps even punishable, forcing you to conceal your true feelings and connections. It was a clandestine world, often existing in the shadows, far from the public. Ceremonies we've discussed. A mainstream historical fact is that while overt same-sex marriage was not recognized, and indeed, laws against sodomy, a broad term that encompassed various non-procreative sexual acts, including homosexual ones, became increasingly harsh towards the later Middle Ages. Informal same-sex relationships certainly existed, and convents, while ostensibly celibate, sometimes fostered deep emotional and even physical bonds between individuals living in close proximity. Imagine the quiet, unspoken affections that could develop between monks sharing a cell or nuns dedicating their lives together to God. These relationships, though not publicly sanctioned, could offer profound companionship and intimacy. A quirky tidbit, however, is the existence of historical rituals, particularly in some early medieval Eastern Christian traditions, that resembled a form of same-sex union, sometimes referred to as adelphopoiesis or brother-making, while often interpreted by modern scholars as rituals of spiritual brotherhood or sworn friendship. Some historians argue they may have had a more intimate, even romantic, dimension, offering a church-sanctioned way for individuals of the same sex to formalize their deep bonds, albeit carefully veiled in religious language. Imagine two men standing before an altar, not as husband and wife, but as brothers, seeking a divine blessing on their profound, lifelong commitment to each other. Historians still argue whether the apparent rise in condemnation and legal persecution of same-sex acts in the later Middle Ages reflected a genuine increase in their prevalence, or if it was simply a more aggressive enforcement of existing, but often overlooked, prohibitions. Did societal attitudes genuinely harden, or did the Church simply exert more effective control over private lives? For you, the medieval individual with same-sex affections, life was a delicate balance of concealment and quiet connection. Love, in its many forms, found ways to bloom, even under the harshest of conditions, a testament to the enduring human need for intimacy and belonging. Even in the most devout and well-ordered medieval households, disagreements were inevitable. But how did medieval couples handle domestic disputes and the law? Forget therapy sessions or quiet discussions over coffee. When arguments escalated beyond a heated word, the avenues for resolution were often public, harsh, and heavily biased by societal norms. Imagine the simmering resentment that could build between a husband and wife, perhaps over property, children, or simply a nagging personality clash, until it burst forth, sometimes violently, into the public sphere. It certainly wasn't about agreeing to disagree. It was often about who held the power. A mainstream historical fact is that within the medieval legal framework, particularly under common law, a husband generally had the legal right to chastise his wife, meaning he could physically discipline her. This horrifying reality stemmed from the concept of coverture, where the husband was seen as the legal head of the household, responsible for maintaining order. While there were often limitations, for example, he couldn't inflict permanent injury or death. The idea that a husband could physically punish his wife was disturbingly normalized. Imagine the dread of a wife knowing that a sharp word or a perceived defiance could lead to a physical reprimand from her husband, with little recourse. It was a bleak reality that starkly highlights the power imbalance in medieval marriage. However, a quirky tidbit is that despite these grim legal rights, there are scattered records of women, particularly in urban areas or those with influential families, appealing to local courts or ecclesiastical authorities for protection against abusive husbands. These cases were rare and difficult, but they do show that some women, against incredible odds, sought legal redress. Imagine a brave medieval woman, perhaps with the support of her family, standing before a judge, recounting her suffering, a testament to resilience in the face of widespread injustice. There were also community pressures. While a husband had legal rights, excessive cruelty could still draw societal disapproval, and even intervention from neighbors or the church. It wasn't exactly a domestic violence hotline, but it was something. Historians still argue whether the legal right of a husband to chastise his wife was widely exercised to its full, brutal extent, or if it was more a theoretical power rarely invoked in practice due to community norms and religious teachings against excessive cruelty. Did the law reflect common behavior, or merely provide a legal justification for an occasional, extreme act? For you, the medieval spouse, navigating domestic disputes meant understanding these stark power dynamics. If you were the wife, it meant exercising caution and perhaps quiet diplomacy. If you were the husband, it meant wielding immense, almost unchecked authority, with all the moral implications that entailed in a society governed by divine law, however imperfectly applied. After exploring the various frameworks and social contracts of medieval marriage, it's time to touch upon a topic that, while deeply private, was fundamentally tied to the institution: sexual expectations within marriage. Forget everything you think you know from modern romance novels. Medieval intimacy was viewed through a very different lens, shaped by theological doctrine, practical necessity, and a surprising range of attitudes. Imagine the quiet, often unromanticized reality of a medieval marriage bed, where procreation was paramount, but other considerations also played a subtle role. A mainstream historical fact is that the primary purpose of sex within medieval marriage, as emphasized by the Church, was procreation. The bonum prolis, the good of offspring, was seen as the highest justification for marital relations. Any sexual act not aimed at conception was often viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation, by theologians. This meant that contraception was forbidden, and discussions of pleasure for its own sake were generally frowned upon. You were, in essence, fulfilling a divine and societal duty to be fruitful and multiply. It certainly made date-night discussions rather straightforward. So, are we going to make more tiny peasants tonight, dear? However, a quirky tidbit is that despite the Church's strictures, there was also a recognized concept of the debitum, conjugal or the conjugal debt. This meant that both husband and wife had a mutual obligation to provide sexual relations to each other upon request. It wasn't just about the man's desire or the woman's duty. It was a reciprocal responsibility. While the emphasis remained on procreation, this concept subtly acknowledged a need for physical companionship within the marriage. Imagine a wife, perhaps tired after a long day, still having the right, and indeed the expectation, that her husband would fulfill his debt, and vice versa. It was less about passionate desire and more about a contractual agreement in the bedroom. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on procreation and its condemnation of non-procreative acts suppressed natural human sexuality and led to widespread guilt and hypocrisy, or if it provided a clear moral framework for intimacy in a world that otherwise offered little guidance. Did it lead to repression, or simply a different form of expression? For you, the medieval spouse, the act of intimacy was loaded with both biological and theological significance. It was a duty, yes, but also the fundamental act that cemented your union, offered the hope of children, and, perhaps, provided a quiet form of physical comfort in a harsh world. It was certainly not about spicing things up with scented candles and mood music. While medieval society was largely homogeneous in its religious adherence to Christianity, at least in Western Europe, there were instances, particularly in borderlands or trading hubs, where individuals found themselves contemplating marriage across religions. Forget modern interfaith dialogue groups. This was a profoundly challenging and often dangerous prospect, fraught with legal, social, and spiritual peril. Imagine the clandestine meetings, the whispered conversations, and the immense social pressure if you, a devout Christian, fell in love with a Jewish merchant or a Muslim scholar. It was less about cultural exchange and more about risking eternal damnation, at least in the eyes of the Church. A mainstream historical fact is that the Church generally prohibited marriages between Christians and non-Christians. These unions were considered illicit and invalid in canon law, as they posed a perceived threat to the spiritual purity of the Christian spouse, and more importantly, the religious upbringing of any children. You wouldn't find a priest officiating such a ceremony, and any children born from such a union might face questions of legitimacy and inheritance. Imagine the stark choice: convert or abandon your beloved. It was a clear line in the sand, drawn by religious authority, not easily crossed. However, a quirky tidbit is that despite these prohibitions, such marriages, or at least cohabitations, did occur, particularly in regions where different religious communities lived in close proximity, such as in Spain during the Reconquista, Sicily, or port cities with diverse populations. Sometimes one partner might convert, or the couple might simply live together informally, risking social ostracization and legal repercussions. Imagine a Jewish woman and a Christian man living together in secret. Their love acquired defiance against the rigid religious boundaries of their time. These relationships were rarely celebrated, often condemned, but they existed as a testament to the enduring power of human connection across seemingly insurmountable divides. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict prohibitions against interfaith marriage were primarily a defensive measure to maintain religious purity and social control, or if they genuinely reflected a fear for the spiritual well-being of its flock. Was it about protecting souls, or about maintaining power structures? For you, the medieval individual caught in such a dilemma, the choice was agonizing. It meant sacrificing either your spiritual salvation or your deepest affections, a testament to the pervasive influence of religious belief on every aspect of medieval life, even the most intimate. Now, let's step inside the medieval home and explore what life in a medieval household truly entailed for a married couple. Forget sprawling mansions with multiple bathrooms and separate bedrooms. Most medieval homes, whether a peasant's hovel or a noble's castle, were primarily functional spaces, bustling with activity, often shared with extended family, servants, and even livestock. Imagine the constant hum of life, the smells of cooking fires and damp straw, the lack of privacy that defined your everyday existence. Your marriage was lived in plain sight, a communal affair, rather than an isolated private world. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval household was not just a living space. It was often the primary unit of production, especially for peasants. If you were a peasant couple, your home was also your workshop, your kitchen, and your nursery, all rolled into one cramped, smoky room. You'd be spinning wool, mending tools, preparing food, and raising children, all within earshot of each other. The daily rhythm was dictated by necessity, waking with the sun, working until dusk, and huddling together for warmth and safety at night. There was no 9-to-5 job. Your life was your work, and your spouse was your indispensable partner in that continuous endeavor. It was definitely a shared workspace, perhaps a little too shared for modern tastes. For noble households, while the scale was grander, the emphasis on communal living and activity remained. Castles were bustling centers of administration, defense, and social life. You, as a noble lady, would oversee a vast household, managing servants, supplies, and social engagements. Your husband, the lord, would manage his lands, his vassals, and his military affairs. Even in a private chamber, true solitude was rare. Servants, attendants, and family members were almost always present. Imagine trying to have a private conversation with your spouse while a dozen servants milled about, pretending not to listen. A quirky tidbit, however, is that despite the lack of modern privacy, there's evidence that medieval homes, even humble ones, often had designated intimate spaces or ways to create temporary seclusion. A curtain around a bed, a separate small chamber for a lord and lady, or even simply the quiet of the late-night hours after everyone else was asleep. Imagine pulling a simple curtain around your shared bed, a small barrier against the constant gaze of the world, providing a brief illusion of privacy in a crowded existence. Historians still argue whether the constant communal living in medieval households fostered stronger family bonds and a sense of collective identity, or if it led to increased domestic friction and a stifling lack of personal space. Did the absence of privacy make relationships more resilient or more strained? For you, the medieval spouse, life in your household was a relentless, shared enterprise. Your partner was not just a spouse, but a fellow laborer, a co-parent, and a constant companion, for better or worse, in the very public theatre of your daily existence. Within the bustling confines of the medieval household, and indeed, within the very fabric of medieval marriage, lay a complex web of power dynamics. Forget any notion of egalitarian partnerships. This was a world largely structured by hierarchy, and within the marital union, that hierarchy usually placed the husband firmly at the top. Imagine navigating a relationship where custom, law, and even religious doctrine reinforced your spouse's authority over you. It wasn't about negotiation or compromise. It was about understanding and, often, accepting the established order. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval husband was generally considered the head of the household, with ultimate authority over his wife, children, and servants. This was rooted in both Roman legal traditions and Christian theological interpretations, particularly Pauline epistles that called for wives to submit to their husbands. You, as a medieval wife, were expected to be obedient, deferential, and to manage the domestic sphere under your husband's overarching direction. He held the legal power, the property rights, as we discussed with Virtue, and the final say in most decisions affecting the family. It was less a partnership and more a corporate structure where he was the CEO and you were, well, you were a very important manager, but still just a manager. It made any kind of medieval power couple rather one-sided. However, a quirky tidbit is that despite these formal structures, women often wielded significant informal power and influence within the household. This wasn't legal authority, but rather the power of persuasion, management, and essential contribution. A wife's skills in running the household, managing provisions, supervising servants, and raising children were absolutely critical to the family's survival and prosperity. Imagine a seemingly subservient medieval wife, subtly steering her husband's decisions with well-placed advice, gentle nagging, or simply by being so indispensable that he couldn't function without her. Her influence was often felt rather than overtly seen, a quiet strength behind the scenes. Historians still argue whether the apparent subjugation of women within medieval marriage truly limited their agency, or if they developed sophisticated strategies of indirect power and influence that are often overlooked by modern scholarship focused on legal rights. Did the formal power structure dictate every aspect of daily life, or did informal networks and personal relationships create pockets of female autonomy? For you, the medieval spouse, understanding these power dynamics was essential for navigating your daily life. If you were the husband, it meant carrying the burden of ultimate responsibility and often decision-making. If you were the wife, it meant exercising intelligence and resilience, finding your voice not in open defiance, but in the quiet, indispensable running of your shared world. Despite the rigid structures, the legal inequalities, and the often harsh realities we've explored, it's important to remember that medieval marriages were not uniformly devoid of warmth, affection, or even joy. Let's consider the often overlooked aspect of marital joys and companionship. Forget the cynical view that all medieval unions were purely transactional. Humans are, after all, creatures of connection, and affection often found a way to blossom, even in the most pragmatic of pairings. Imagine the quiet comfort of a shared glance across a flickering fire, the unspoken understanding forged through years of shared hardship and triumph. A mainstream historical fact is that while love might not have been the reason for marriage, it could certainly develop within marriage. Shared experiences, raising children together, overcoming challenges, and simply enduring the daily grind, side by side, often fostered deep bonds of respect, loyalty, and genuine affection. You might find solace in your spouse's presence during a long, cold winter, or celebrate a bountiful harvest with a shared, heartfelt laugh. This wasn't the passionate, fiery romance of courtly love, but a more enduring, practical, and deeply rooted companionship. It was the kind of love that came from knowing someone's every habit, good and bad, and choosing to stay anyway. A quirky tidbit, however, is that while public displays of affection were rare, private expressions of tenderness certainly existed. Surviving letters, though few, sometimes reveal glimpses of genuine fondness between spouses. Imagine a husband writing to his wife while away on campaign, perhaps asking after the children or expressing a longing for her company, even if couched in formal language. There are also wills that leave unusually generous bequests to a surviving spouse, or epitaphs that speak of a beloved wife or faithful husband, hinting at deeper emotional connections that transcended mere duty. These were quiet testaments to affection, often found hidden within the dry records of history. Historians still argue whether the absence of high romantic expectations in medieval marriage allowed for a more realistic and ultimately stable form of companionship to develop, free from the disillusionment that modern romantic ideals sometimes bring. Did the pragmatic foundation actually make these relationships more resilient? For you, the medieval spouse, joy might have come not from grand gestures, but from the simple rhythms of shared life, the warmth of another body beside you on a cold night, the shared pride in your children, the comfort of a familiar presence in a world of uncertainty. Your marriage was a partnership, a family unit, and often a quiet source of enduring companionship. Beyond the practicalities of land, lineage, and labor, medieval weddings, like celebrations today, often involved the exchange of gifts. But let's explore some of the more unique wedding gifts that might have been exchanged, far beyond the blenders and toaster ovens of modern registries. Imagine receiving a present that was not merely symbolic, but deeply practical, or perhaps even imbued with superstitious significance. These weren't about luxury, they were about utility, luck, and securing the new household's future. It definitely put what to get the happy couple into a very different historical context. A mainstream historical fact is that gifts in medieval marriages were often incredibly practical and directly related to the establishment of the new household. For peasant couples, gifts might include livestock, a cow, a few chickens, a pig, which were invaluable assets for food, labor, and economic security. You might receive farming tools, cooking pots, a loom for weaving, or bolts of cloth. These weren't just thoughtful gestures, they were essential contributions to the couple's ability to survive and thrive. Imagine opening your wedding gifts and finding a healthy piglet squealing happily. That was true medieval wealth. For noble families, gifts would naturally be grander, reflecting their wealth and status. This could include expensive textiles, furs, jewelry, though often simpler than modern pieces, silver tableware, or even small parcels of land. Sometimes gifts of armor, weapons, or horses were given, emphasizing the martial aspects of noble life and the husband's role as protector. Imagine a noble bride receiving a finely embroidered tapestry for her new home, a luxurious item that spoke volumes about her family's prestige. A quirky tidbit, however, is the prevalence of more symbolic or superstitious gifts, particularly among the common folk, designed to ensure fertility, good fortune, or ward off evil. You might receive a specific herb bundle tied with colored ribbons for good luck, or a small carved effigy meant to ensure a plentiful family. In some regions, bread or salt were given, symbolizing sustenance and preservation. Imagine a quirky aunt giving you a small, oddly shaped root, whispering about its power to ward off barrenness. It was a blend of practical hope and deeply ingrained folk belief. Historians still argue whether the practical nature of medieval wedding gifts reflected a society that valued utility over sentimentality, or if these gifts, despite their pragmatic appearance, carried deep emotional significance as symbols of community support and family investment in the new union. Did a gift of a cow represent mere assets, or a profound wish for prosperity and a thriving future? For you, the medieval newlywed, each gift, whether a sturdy cooking pot or a humble bag of seeds, was a tangible investment in your shared future, a small but vital piece of the foundation upon which your new life would be built. As we approach the end of our journey through medieval marriage, let's consider the enduring legacy of medieval marriage and how these ancient practices subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, shaped the marital customs and expectations that would follow for centuries, even up to our own time. Forget the notion that modern marriage sprang fully formed from some recent enlightenment. Its roots delve deep into the soil of medieval traditions. Some still recognizable, others now happily discarded. A mainstream historical fact is that many fundamental aspects of modern Western marriage, particularly within the Christian tradition, find their origins in medieval canon law and societal norms. The concept of marriage as a permanent, monogamous union, requiring mutual consent eventually, and often solemnized in a church, is a direct inheritance from the medieval period. The idea of marriage as a sacrament, indissoluble except by death or annulment, heavily influenced legal and social views for centuries. Even the tradition of the public wedding ceremony, with vows exchanged before witnesses, has deep medieval roots. Imagine how much of what you consider traditional about a wedding would still be recognizable to a medieval peasant or noble. It's a bit like finding out your favorite band's newest hit is actually a cover of a Gregorian chant. However, a quirky tidbit is how long some of the more archaic medieval practices persisted, sometimes well into the early modern period. For example, parental consent remained paramount in many aristocratic circles for centuries, long after individual consent became legally enshrined for commoners. And while dowries diminished in importance in some regions, they continued to be a significant feature of European marriage negotiations for noble and wealthy families almost into the 20th century. Imagine a young Victorian woman still having to worry about her marriage portion, just like her medieval ancestor, a persistent echo from a bygone era. Historians still argue whether the Church's strong emphasis on marriage as a sacrament was primarily a force for social stability, providing a moral framework and discouraging easy divorce, or if its rigid rules created unnecessary suffering by trapping individuals in unhappy or dysfunctional unions. Did it solidify societal norms, or did it merely extend hardship? For you, the modern observer, understanding the legacy of medieval marriage offers a fascinating lens through which to view your own traditions. It shows you how deeply embedded certain ideas are, and how slowly, yet surely, societal norms can shift and evolve, moving from purely pragmatic alliances to something, perhaps, a little more romantic. While marriage was the expected path for most medieval individuals, it wasn't the only one. Let's delve into the fascinating, often surprising, world of unmarried life and alternatives to the marital bond. Forget the modern pressures of societal expectations for partnership. In the Middle Ages, life outside of marriage, while challenging, offered different avenues for purpose, community, and sometimes even a degree of autonomy rarely found within matrimony. Imagine choosing a life not bound by dowries or heirs, but by spiritual devotion or humble self-sufficiency. A mainstream historical fact is that for many women, particularly those of noble or gentry birth who did not marry, the convent offered a legitimate and often respected alternative. You, as a medieval woman, might enter a convent not out of a fervent spiritual calling, but as a practical solution if a suitable husband could not be found, or if your family wished to avoid splitting an inheritance among too many daughters. Within the convent walls, you could find community, education, and intellectual pursuits denied to most married women. It was a life of piety, but also of structure and relative security. It certainly beat living in your brother's household as a perpetual burden, eternally doing needlework. For men, the monastic life also offered an alternative to marriage, allowing them to pursue spiritual devotion, scholarship, or administrative roles within the church. You might become a monk, dedicating your life to prayer and study, or a secular cleric, serving a lord or a bishop. For both sexes, these religious paths allowed for a life of celibacy, avoiding the demands and complications of marriage. A quirky tidbit, however, is that for commoners, particularly in urban areas, unmarried life was more challenging but not entirely unheard of. Some individuals, both men and women, might remain single, working as servants, artisans, or laborers. While lacking the security of a marital partnership, some might have found a different kind of freedom. Imagine a bustling medieval town, where a few independent women might run small shops or work in trades, perhaps living in small shared quarters with other unmarried individuals, defying societal norms through sheer necessity or quiet choice. Historians still argue whether the monastic life genuinely offered empowerment for women by providing intellectual and spiritual freedom, or if it was merely another form of societal control, a convenient way to manage surplus women. Did it provide genuine agency, or simply a different kind of gilded cage? For you, the medieval individual considering these alternatives, the choice was often stark. The known path of marriage, with its duties and expectations, or the less common, but potentially more autonomous, road of celibacy and spiritual or independent service. As we near the close of our exploration, let's consider how a medieval union might finally reach its conclusion, beyond the solemn finality of death or the intricate legal maneuvering of annulment. We'll explore the end of a medieval union in ways that might surprise you, beyond simply happily ever after or tragic demise. Forget the dramatic breakups of modern relationships. The dissolution of a medieval marriage, while rare, could unfold in subtle, often devastating ways, leaving individuals adrift in a society built on the bedrock of marital stability. A mainstream historical fact is that true divorce, in the modern sense of a legal dissolution of a valid marriage allowing for remarriage, was simply not permitted by the Church for most of the medieval period. As we discussed, an annulment was the only way to declare a marriage never existed. However, there were legal mechanisms for separation from bed and board divorcium, a mensa et thro. This meant a couple could be legally separated, perhaps due to cruelty, adultery, or extreme incompatibility, but they remained legally married in the eyes of God and the Church. You couldn't remarry. You were just no longer compelled to live together or share a bed. Imagine the awkwardness of living in a world where you're technically still married to someone you haven't seen in years, unable to move on. It was like a very, very long-term, legally enforced break. This legal separation often came with complex arrangements for financial support, particularly for the wife, which could be incredibly difficult to enforce. Imagine a woman, legally separated but still married, trying to secure her maintenance from a reluctant husband, perhaps relying on family support or the kindness of sympathetic church officials. It was a half measure, offering relief from an unbearable situation but denying the possibility of a fresh start. A quirky tidbit, however, is that, despite the legal and religious strictures, informal or de facto separations certainly occurred. Sometimes, a spouse might simply abandon the other, or one might flee an abusive situation, effectively ending the union in practice if not in law. These situations often left the abandoned spouse in a precarious legal and social limbo, unable to remarry, yet without the presence or support of their legal partner. Imagine a medieval person, years after their spouse disappeared, still technically married, navigating a world that offered no easy path to freedom. Historians still argue whether the Church's strong stance against divorce, even when faced with extreme marital breakdown, ultimately preserved the sanctity of marriage at the cost of individual suffering, or if it merely pushed marital discord into less formal, and often more dangerous, forms of separation. Did it maintain social order, or did it create hidden misery? For you, the medieval individual, the end of a union, whatever its form, was a profound upheaval, marking a difficult transition in a life already filled with uncertainty. It was a testament to how deeply interwoven the institution of marriage was with every thread of medieval society. As our journey through the intricate, often perplexing, and surprisingly resilient world of medieval marriage draws to a close, let's take a moment to reflect on some enduring lessons for today. Forget simply judging the past by modern standards. Instead, consider what these historical glimpses can illuminate about our own relationships, our societal expectations, and the ever-evolving nature of human connection. What can a 1,000-year-old arranged marriage teach you about your latest dating app woes? Perhaps more than you'd think, a mainstream historical fact that offers a fascinating contemporary parallel is the pervasive influence of economic stability on marital decisions. Just as medieval marriages were often about securing land, resources, and family survival, modern relationships, despite our romantic ideals, are still profoundly shaped by financial considerations. You might not be marrying for a dowry of sheep, but financial compatibility, shared goals, and economic security often play a far greater role in long-term partnership success than any initial spark. It's a reminder that beneath all the romantic fluff, practicality often quietly underpins enduring unions, a truth that medieval people understood implicitly. A quirky tidbit, however, is the medieval emphasis on marriage as a community affair, witnessed and supported or sometimes judged by the wider village or town. Compare this to the increasing privatization of modern relationships, where couples often exist in their own insulated bubbles. Perhaps there's a quiet lesson here in the value of communal support, of neighbors and extended family acting as a social safety net, not just for the couple, but for the entire fabric of society. Imagine your entire neighborhood knowing exactly what's going on in your relationship. Perhaps a little terrifying, but also a constant source of support and accountability. It definitely made the concept of a private life something entirely different. Historians still argue whether the longevity of many medieval marriages, despite their often pragmatic origins, stemmed from lower expectations for individual emotional fulfillment, or if the sheer necessity of partnership simply bred a different kind of resilience and commitment. Did they just put up with it? Or did they forge a deeper, more robust bond out of shared struggle? For you, the modern listener, perhaps the greatest lesson from medieval marriage is the enduring human capacity for adaptation. Love, companionship, and family found ways to thrive within incredibly restrictive frameworks, transforming necessity into connection, duty into quiet affection. It's a testament to the fact that while the trappings of marriage change, the fundamental human need for partnership remains, however it's defined by the age. As you drift now, let the echoes of medieval vows and ancient household rhythms gently fade. Imagine the soft glow of a hearth fire in a humble peasant home, or the distant clang of a castle gate. Feel the quiet presence of those who lived and loved, perhaps not as we do, but with a profound depth born of their own time. The demands of medieval life, the strictures of society, the enduring power of human connection, they all intertwine, becoming a soothing whisper in the vast tapestry of history. Let these stories settle softly, like dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, until they merge with your dreams. Sweet dreams.